You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by translator Ian Winick, who's here to discuss the way in which the French can so quickly and easily change from a formal to an informal register, thanks to a concept known as tutoiement. I am so excited to welcome Ian Winick to the podcast. Ian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And before we start talking about this discrepancy between yous, which is a topic that people have been requesting for a very long time on this podcast, so I'm so excited to finally get into it. Could you, and you, I say in English with only one choice, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what sort of led you to start thinking about the various forms of you?
Right. I'm originally from Dublin. I've been living in Germany for 25 years, and I've been a freelance translator and copywriter for the last 20 years. I translate from German and French to English.
Awesome.
Yeah. French was always my first love, linguistically speaking. And because I've been living in Germany for the past 25 years, and I sort of lost touch with it a bit. When I first arrived here, I had lots of French friends, and I sought out French speakers, but they gradually moved away from me. I don't know. So I sort of lost touch. And then a couple of years later, I was playing tennis with a French friend, and we started chatting in French. And then all of a sudden, all sorts of words, for example, frangin, the slang word for brother, they all started bubbling up from the surface, words I hadn't used in 15 years or so. And I kind of thought, okay, it's all still there. It just needs to be coaxed out. It just needs practice. All the grammatical basis was there because I used to teach French. So that was all there and solid, but it was just a matter of practicing and a matter of, bringing everything to the surface again. So it's more a voyage of rediscovery rather than actually discovering.
Okay, amazing. And I love that you used to teach French too, because I think this difference between tu and vous is something that just feels so insurmountable as a native Anglophone learning French. It's so hard to figure out when to use which. And you having the German background as well, I mean, I don't know if there are tons of differences between the way that Germans use formal and informal you and French. But before we even get into that, I'm getting ahead of myself. Par for the course. So in French, for those who aren't familiar or for those who didn't know, we have two different forms of the pronoun you. So we have tu, which is the informal you, and then we have vous, which is both the formal and the plural you. And to use the word tu in French is a practice we call tutoiement, which is a noun that means to say tu. And when we use the word vous, we use the word vouvoiement, so to use the word vous. But learning these differences is one of the most difficult things to traverse. I've seen flow charts. I'll stick one in the show notes that basically shows that, if you're a child who's a prince, we use vous. Do you have a sort of understanding of what the rule or what the rules are for when you use tu, when you use vous in this day and age?
Yes, in most cases, it's quite simple. And in fact, for kids at school, the main thing is getting their head around the fact that there are two words for you. For Germans and other languages where you have two words for you, it's not a problem. But for us Anglophones, you have to get your head around that. And once you get your head around that, if you're at school and you're 12 or 13, it's not all that difficult really, because you would use the informal tu to your friends and to your family, and pretty much everyone else is vous. So it's not really all that difficult in practice. It's more difficult for the teachers, for example, because it's a bit of a gray area if you're talking to a 16-year-old and if you use tu or if you use the formal vous. It really depends on your teaching style, because it is a gray area. And I think there are schools that have hard and fast rules, as of a certain age or as of a certain class, you have to use the formal you. But for the kids themselves, really, it's not much of it's more of a mental roadblock that you have to get past first, I would say.
Okay. So the way that I originally found you was actually through a blog post that you shared on your website, where you talked a little bit about a translation conundrum that you had faced, where you had seen someone translating this switch, this code switch from vous to tu, as the use of someone's first name, because that was kind of the closest equivalent that we had in English. And I was just wondering, when we're thinking about propriety and we're thinking about familiarity, do you get the sense that that is sort of the equivalent in English, that like going from, Mrs. So-and-so to Ethel is the same as calling someone by tu, basically? Are those cultural equivalents?
Yes, to a certain extent. But for example, in the business context in the UK or in the US, where first names are standard, a French person could be forgiven for thinking that there's no hierarchy there because everyone is on first name terms. But they're not. Mm. So there are more subtle ways of phrasing that, or there are more subtle ways of conveying that. And in the same way, it's harder for learners of English to actually convey the respect that you have to show to people that you don't know. Because in French, for example, you would just use the vous form, and that would do most of the heavy lifting. As in, you would just phrase it in the vous form, and it's automatically polite, and you're showing the required amount of respect. Whereas if you're in a cafe, for example, in England, and you want someone to pass the salt, some stranger to pass the salt, you would say something like, "Excuse me, would you mind passing me the salt?" So you would phrase that differently. Whereas if you were at home with your brother, you might say, "Could you pass me the salt?" Or "Pass me the salt," or something like that.
Okay. So it's almost as though the respect that you need is kind of baked in when you have two different forms of you, whereas in English, you're going to have to find a new way to convey that?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, cool. So one thing that I find interesting as well is I think that one sort of innate understanding that native English speakers who are learning French, I think erroneously intuit, is that French is over formal because it has this extra you. And we always seem to intuit, or at least I did, that vous is more formal than what we have in English. But actually English, when we think about Shakespearean English, we used to have our own tu. We used to have thou, and we don't have that anymore. So we're using a formal you with everyone. Now, obviously, that's something that even as a native English speaker, I didn't intuit. So, do you get the sense that native English speakers are more formal all the time than French speakers are, or less formal? Or are we sort of somewhere in the middle because we don't have multiple tu?
It's like what I said about the example with the salt. Because you don't have the distinction between the two forms of you'll be more aware of how you're phrasing something else. So there'll be lots of different ways of saying, "Can you pass me the salt?" Whereas in French, there might just be a couple. Because the vous conveys the respect that you need to have towards people you don't know in order to be polite, basically.
And because we don't have that line, and specifically because we don't have this question, which I remember having to ask. When I first moved to France when I was 14 years old and living with a family, I used vous with the parents. Mm-hmm. And I remembered in my textbooks, there was this question of on peut se tutoyer. And I feel like that happens now in my professional life a lot. When I meet people I'm going to be working with, I'm a freelancer, so I'm meeting a lot of new temporary colleagues frequently. And every once in a while, you'll start saying vous to somebody and then you say, on peut se tutoyer, can we say tu to one another? And it breaks that boundary and suddenly you don't have to speak in that formal context. Mm-hmm. Whereas in English, because we don't have that line in the sand, do you think that we're more formal with one another for longer? Or do you think that we're less formal with one another from the outset? How do you intuit the difference between how formal one begins a relationship in France versus how formal one begins a relationship, let's say a working relationship in an Anglophone context?
I think there's a certain wall of formality you have to get over, first of all, in France, for example. So if you're working together with somebody, you might use vous to begin with, and then you're working with them every day and you're getting on well. And then it's perfectly normal for one of you to suggest using the informal tu, or you might use it by mistake and the other person says, "Oh yeah, it's fine. Let's stay that way." So this sort of thing happens quite often. Yeah. And that would happen often. I would notice that, for example, with colleagues. For example, if somebody recommends a French translator to me, and I contact them, then I might use the tu form automatically. If I know they're roughly in my age or whatever, or if we're both good friends with our common contact, for example.
So you obviously spend most of your time in Germany, and German has a similar structure. I'm not personally familiar with it. I don't speak German. So can you share a little bit about how the German you system compares to the French one, for example?
By and large, it's the same. I mean, you have a German word for you, which is sie, and then you would have the informal word, which is du, which is pretty much tu. So by and large, it would be the same thing. I would say the Germans are slightly less formal. They'd be more inclined to switch to the informal du a bit sooner than a similar situation in France, for example. That's been my experience anyway. And also, I think one of the differences that in France, sometimes you have a situation where you use a first name and vous. For example, I have a new French customer and she calls me Ian, but she uses vous the whole time. Whereas in German, you wouldn't do that, except in game shows on television. You have an old man whose name is Dieter because, to have Herr Schmidt or whatever on the panel would look weird. So you call him Dieter, but you would use the formal Sie. And you see that in France as well a lot, but not just on TV. You would see that in schools, for example. A teacher might call a 16-year-old kid Olivier, but you might use vous because he's 16 and because the teacher thinks that's appropriate. But you don't get that in German outside game shows. So I think because you don't have this step in between, which is quite comfortable, if you can be semi-formal. So like with this customer who calls me Ian and calls me vous, I would imagine that situation will stay that way forever. Whereas if I have a new German customer that I get on well with, it might be Herr Winick to begin with. But then, if we're working together for a couple of weeks or whatever, and we're getting on, then it would be quite natural for one of us, well, usually the customer, to suggest that we drop the Sie and move to the formal du.
And that suggestion is so interesting. But you also mentioned something that I think we need to resurface, which is that often, and this happens to me all the time, even, I've been here a long time, but because I don't have that break of tu and vous, I'll make the mistake sometimes if I'm getting along with somebody, accidentally say tu. And then as you said, sometimes people will be like, oh yeah, that's fine. Let's just do that. And it really does feel in that instant as though a barrier has been broken and you get to completely switch language registers. Now, of course, if you're in a professional context, you're not going to go start using, swear words all the time. Although the French are more comfortable with swear words than at least Americans are. I'm not sure about the Irish.
I won't comment on that.
Yeah, but it's a very quick evolution.
Yes.
When you switch from vous to tu. And in English, I think maybe because we don't have that strong barrier, it's a little bit more of a slow drip towards the change. That being said, there's a much more macro level change happening right now in France that I'm witnessing. And I know that you don't spend maybe as much time here. I'm not sure if you've seen this at all in your travels or in your communications with French people. But I remember when I was in Spain, for example, in certain neighborhoods, like waiters would use the informal you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm starting to see that in France.
Yes.
Where there's, you walk into a very hipster cafe or, a really, there's a bar that I go to that is, just this side of communist, and they don't use vous at all. They use tu with everybody.
Yeah.
Is this something that you're seeing? Is this something that you're expecting to happen more and more, where France becomes less and less formal?
Yes. I think that France is gradually evolving in the direction of the Netherlands, who used to have, who still have a formal and an informal as well, but the formal is pretty much dying out. It's very rare that you would actually use the formal one, except in very, very formal contexts. And I've noticed the last time I was in France that I went to a restaurant and the waiter, who was about my age, he used the informal tu as well, which probably wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. So I have noticed that. I think that we mostly in big cities and the younger generation. That's been my experience.
That makes sense because it's continuing in this vein we've had of a devolution of vous. I mean, I think one of the funniest ones, at least from the perspective of modern eyes, was the way that former President Jacques Chirac and his wife Bernadette spoke to each other.
Yes.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, they used the formal vous to each other, despite having been married for I have no idea how long, but they would. There's something slightly aristocratic about that, I think. You only really find that I've seen it in television series, as well. And it's where a husband and wife who have been, married half their lives, who have had kids together, they still use the formal vous in the same way as Jane Austen's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, for example, in Pride and Prejudice. They called each other Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, which, if you're reading it now, it sounds very, very weird. And often it makes you wonder how things work in the bedroom.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, dancers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. If you had a text, for example, where, I see this in literature on occasion where it's either, a married couple who are using vous with one another, or even in like a modern film or literary setting, if you have someone engaging, for example, with a sex worker, sometimes you'd have the formal you, even in a very informal, perhaps the least formal context possible. So how would you kind of translate that for an English reader?
I would probably use more stilted phrasing, sort of phrasing like that you wouldn't use talking to a friend or whatever. The kind of language you might use to a waiter in a restaurant, for example. So polite, but a little bit of a distance.
Interesting.
I don't actually translate literature. I do screenplays and stuff like that occasionally, but that's not really my area. But off the top of my head, that is how.
Yeah, and I suppose in a screenplay that would work really well as well, using more stilted language, and then hopefully there would be some kind of note there so that the director would know that there is this distance and this linguistic respect, even though, it just seems so, I guess, to a native English speaker, it just seems so backwards to use such formal language in such an informal setting.
Mm-hmm.
But is it to convey distance? Is it to convey respect? What do you think the sort of mindset behind that is, if you had to guess, behind this tendency?
Yes, I think it's to convey respect. And perhaps in the exact case you're talking about, perhaps it's, we don't have a relationship. This is a business transaction. It could be to convey that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess that sort of also, when you were saying with schools, when you're conveying distance between teachers and the students, but also the teachers are required to use vous with one another, I guess it is another thing of, we're not friends. I'm not your friend.
Yeah, in the same way that you don't usually call teachers by their first names, for example. So you have to keep a certain amount of distance in order to have a certain amount of respect. Now, there are teachers, for example, I remember my sister had an art teacher that she used to call by her first name, but that is very much the exception.
And do you get the sense that, when adolescents are starting to come into their own and want to be a little bit daring or voluntarily not show respect to adults, is saying tu to somebody in charge something that a young French adolescent would experiment with, do you think? Or would it not even occur to them to be disrespectful in that way?
Yes. I would say, for example, if a French teenager is vandalizing a wall or something and the police arrive and he's just trying to be snotty and trying to just say, I don't care, do what you want, then he's not going to use the vous. He's going to use the tu in order to show that he doesn't respect at all.
Okay. So it is this sort of signal, this linguistic signal, where if you don't have the tools to decode it, you might not even know you were being disrespected. You totally could be.
Yes, that is true. But I think in most... Okay, for example, I remember, this was a long time ago, talking to an Irish woman who used to teach French and German. I think it was at a French conversation exchange somewhere. And she told me that her superpower, well, it wasn't how she phrased it, but her superpower was starting conversations without using tu or vous so that she could follow the French person's lead. And this was a kind of obsession. And I often think about that because I think that hasn't been my experience. My experience is that it's usually quite clear from the context. For example, if I'm in the kind of bar that you mentioned, for example, or if I'm playing at a tennis competition with people I don't know, or if I'm making music or whatever with people I don't know, there's a sort of shared camaraderie where it would be quite weird to use the formal Sie or to use the formal vous in French. So, I think that, okay, it's good to be aware of these things, but I don't think you need a flowchart. I really don't think you need a flowchart.
Fair enough. That is an interesting superpower. I actually knew a French person who was able to do that by saying il. Like if he encountered somebody that he knew but wasn't sure if he was supposed to be saying tu or vous, he would look at this man and say, alors comment il va? Or comment on va? Like, how is he doing? But talking to the person in their face, or saying, how are we doing?
Yes.
And waiting. So yeah, there is some linguistic gymnastics that you can do to get around it, I suppose.
Yes, I have a similar situation in German, actually, which I think is peculiar to Cologne. We have a window cleaner who has been cleaning my wife's windows since before my time, and now he cleans our windows. And when I first met him, he used to use the plural informal form. So in German, if you're talking to one person, you would say du. If you're talking to two people you know, you would say ihr. And that's what he did to me. So afterwards, I went out to my wife and I said, why is he talking to me like I'm several different people? And he says he doesn't know whether to use the formal or the informal. So he's opting for this halfway thing. And I've never heard that anywhere before. And apparently it's peculiar to Cologne. And there could be a French influence there because the French spent a lot of time in Cologne around the time of Napoleon, for example. So there are a lot of words in use here that are influenced by the French. And it could be because vous in French is not just the formal singular, but it's also the plural, then it could be because of that. I have no idea. I was just thinking about that yesterday.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Because in Spanish, there's a difference as well of, the formal singular versus the informal plural. And in French, you're right. Like, if you say vous, you might mean multiple yous, or you might mean one big you.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast and for sharing all of your knowledge.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Before I let you go, I just have one additional question.
Yes.
Which is, what is your favorite word in French?
One expression I really liked when I was studying in France, I did my Erasmus year in France. So my third year of university, I spent 2 semesters studying in Lyon. And one expression that I really loved was tu m'étonnes, which is sort of like you bet or you don't say or something like that. And when I went back to Ireland, there was a tu m'étonnes shaped hole in my life for about 3 months because I kept wanting to say this, but there was no equivalent because I wouldn't, you bet or you don't say isn't something I would say in English. So if I had to choose in the spur of the moment, I would probably say something like that. But there are loads and loads of lovely words and expressions in French. Another one, for example, sauver les meubles, literally to save the furniture. It means to make the best of a bad job. So if some project is really going to pot, then you could save what you can.
Okay. Those are some great expressions. I love idioms. And you're right. When you're missing one in the other language, there is almost like a hole. What would you say now if you had to say tu m'étonnes, or would you just not say it in English?
I don't have that hole in my life anymore.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. You'll have to go back to Lyon.
Yes, I probably will.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Have a really fantastic rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Bye-bye.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.